Hello and welcome to our webinar Decoding B23. My name is Grant Ballard-Tremere and I am CEO and founder of the company ECO. We're going to look at the findings from a survey and the GCF Insight report that we prepared based on that survey that looks at the issue of country ownership. After that, we'll get some insights from our attendants at the board meeting, and there'll be a lot to discuss around that. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for discussion on any of your questions. We'll try and give as thorough answers as we can. If we run out of time, don't worry. During this webinar, we'll be sending you by email the video of the webinar itself, plus the presentations and all answers to questions that you ask. While the webinar is underway, type in any questions you have into the chat facility and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Right, I think that's everything. Let's get going. We're now going to have a presentation about our GCF Insight report on country ownership. Country ownership is one of the critical ingredients in Green Climate Fund projects. And the Green Climate Fund puts itself forward as an organization which is country driven as a primary criteria for GCF projects. We've carried out a survey which my colleague Mel Fitare will present to us in a short moment. Mel is a senior consultant in our team with over 20 years of experience in a diverse range of subjects, including climate change, of course, gender mainstreaming and emergency and humanitarian response. So over to Mel.
Thank you, Grant, and good afternoon to everyone. We took this opportunity to focus on enhancing country ownership as we see this topic as both important and evolving. This is indicated by a movement on several fronts, primarily through the GCF's governing instrument, which provides that the fund will pursue a country-driven approach and promote and strengthen engagement at the country level through effective involvement of relevant institutions and stakeholders. This was affirmed as a core principle of the fund during board meeting 8. During these board meetings, there's been notable refinements of country ownership, such as establishing the role of the NDA or focal point in the approvals process with the no objection letter, the addition of best practice guidelines for multi-stakeholder engagement, outlining accreditation processes, information on the readiness and preparatory support program, and guiding principles. In terms of our methodology, it was a two-pronged approach. We undertook an online survey, which was conducted in June 2019. We had 83 respondents of that survey. In terms of the survey overview, we had 70% of our respondents who have experience with GCF projects, and of those, 30% have a significant experience. So firstly, in the survey, we asked the basic question, what is country ownership? Interestingly, there was some variation in the responses. Next, we asked the question, what is the GCF's extent of addressing country ownership? And to this, we saw 44% of respondents say that the GCF is actually doing a reasonably good job, but with some shortcomings. We had another 20% suggest that the GCF efforts to address these issues were comprehensive. And then finally, 16% who said there were major shortcomings. Unfortunately, we didn't dig down further on that question, so we don't know what you feel those shortcomings may be. At this point, I'd like to share a clip from Board Meeting 23 with Mr. Eduardo Freitas, and we posed the question, what does country ownership mean to the GCF? Here's his response.
Country ownership is an important part of the mandate of the GCF. To us, it means that countries are prepared and have the capacity to present correctly their priorities to work with the GCF, and that means that they have all the capacities in place to, in terms of institutions, in terms of technical capacity, human capacity, to drive their agenda, the agenda that they want to push forward with the GCF. This is not the sole responsibility of the National Designated Authority of the focal point of the GCF, which are a key stakeholder for us, but not a gatekeeper. They are the institution that represent the country vis-a-vis the actions of the GCF. They are the institutions that are supposed to mobilize, keep oversight of national stakeholders, mobilizing in a way that allows the GCF to understand what are the country's key investment areas, or the investments that they want to drive the GCF towards in their countries, and let us know also from looking perhaps from a different angle, letting us know what is that they need for the GCF to support in the short and long terms.
Our next question focuses on how stakeholder engagement is undertaken as part of country ownership. Now, this is a question that we also posed in GCF Insight number 10. So you can see here that 47% of respondees follow best practice, and that is circled in red. So best practice is where we would see prioritisation of stakeholder engagement, where there is a mutual exchange, and where plans are adjusted, building in stakeholder feedback. We see that 30% of respondees are proactively informing stakeholders, so this is more of a one-way flow of information. We then see a grouping of 23% failing really to build in beneficiary engagement for country ownership from the outset. Now, when we look at group responses, on the whole, NDAs tend to rank higher towards following best practice, while consultants ranked lower, and accredited entities fell in between these two areas. To hear more on stakeholder influence and participation, here is a clip of Mr. Tungabhadra Rai, who was interviewed recently at B23 by my colleague Ben Bartle.
Let me emphasize that county ownership does not simply mean the ownership of the government. It's the ownership of all the people of the country, including of the indigenous peoples, women, and the marginalized groups. So, having said that, the barrier or the mainstay for the ensuring county ownership would be to engage those different section, different group of people from the very beginning of the project to the implementation and monitoring and auditing of the project. So I think, yeah, full and effective participation of indigenous peoples, women, and marginalized groups from the very beginning is key.
When it comes to barriers and challenges, we asked what are the most significant barriers to enhancing country ownership? And here we provided 3 answers, and in terms of responses, a majority, 64%, say that low institutional capacity is the greatest barrier. This was followed by 15% who believe requirements of the GCF exclude national stakeholders, and finally 8% who cite a low project ambition. We'd like to pose a question to the listeners now. Given the regional, country and entity variation, could a differentiated approach to country ownership be the answer? What would this look like if you agree? If you'd like to respond, please type your answers into the chat room now. We turn our focus now to accountability, and we pose the question, how should the GCF hold accredited entities accountable to country ownership? When we look at the chart here, we can see that a majority of respondents, 63% in fact, indicated that national stakeholders should be engaged from the very beginning of the project. A further 37% of respondents indicated the need for mandatory reporting from all entities on results of strengthening institutional and regulatory systems. And then 14% indicated that the GCF should assess the quality and effectiveness of capacity building support provided by accredited entities. In terms of other findings related to accountability, respondents signalled that accountability in delivering country ownership post-project approval requires more support, effective mechanisms and/or tools from the GCF. So we also received suggestions for how to overcome a lack of accountability or follow through with country ownership. These included options such as, in conclusion, we can see that the GCF has demonstrated support based on GCF enhanced country ownership aligned though, or rejection of proposals without an effective NDA a lack of coordination and collaboration between roles of nationally designated authorities or focal points, accredited entities and the Secretariat hinders country ownership opportunities. This point was touched on by a number of responses in the open response section of the survey. Firstly, GCF support for donor-investor alignment with enhanced country ownership. Also, GCF better understanding of country ownership shortfalls. We discussed differentiated and flexible models, possibly prescribed activity template plans, established NDA structures being in place, increasing coordination between NDAs and accredited entities, and increased support for new direct access entities, as well as more guidance on the readiness program. Finally, the GCF's Independent Evaluation Unit will be presenting their findings during the last year on country ownership to the board at B24 in November this year. As you can see from the Insight 12 editorial, there were 2 questions that the Independent Evaluation Unit has been focused on. These include how well the GCF has conceptualised and operationalised country ownership, and secondly, how country ownership can be integrated into projects from design to implementation. We look forward to hearing those results and also your thoughts at the end of this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. Remember, if you have any questions, just put them into the chat and we'll get to them as soon as we can after the next presentation. Our senior consultant, Ben Bartle, went to Sondo for the last board meeting, was in discussions in the corridors and understanding all the different things that are taking place there. So he's fresh from that meeting with ideas and thoughts. Ben has over 10 years of experience in project formulation, climate change finance, and capacity development. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I've just returned from the 23rd meeting of the GCF board in Songdo. The meeting itself heralded some positive outcomes in climate finance. A number of projects and additional accredited entities were approved at the board. One of the major sticky issues, which was the decision-making in the absence of consensus, was approved. We have an update on policies and reports, a few comments on the GCF replenishment, as well as some surprising and not so surprising results from the independent review of GCF performance by the Independent Evaluation Unit of the GCF. So at the meeting, the board approved 10 new projects. They weren't all completely without contention. The board allocated $266.9 million in GCF resources for climate action, with co-financing of the projects channeling over $1.4 billion for low emissions and climate resilient development in those projects. One project approved was from the medium to small enterprises request for proposal. One SAP project was approved, and one project was approved, and the first project from the Mobilising Funds at Scale RFP from the private sector facility. Overall, the package of projects, 41% was mitigation and 59% adaptation. There were a number of comments generally from the board. The board commented that they wanted to see direct access proposals. Lars Roth said much work remains to ensure that projects are really contributing to the results management framework of the GCF. Funding proposals are still lacking ambition was another comment that was coming across, and national ownership needed to be improved. CSOs, the civil society organisation representative in particular, said that it's important to improve transparency and reduce the misuse of funding. Importantly, Jerry Velasquez, the director from the Division of Mitigation and Adaptation at the Secretariat, said that by B24, all of these issues related to disclosure of information would be resolved and the information would be released. So there were a number of notable projects, including Ecuador. The second RED Plus results-based payments project was approved. Importantly, also the first project for Mobilising Funds at Scale was approved. This was an interesting project for solar gravity-pumped hydro hybrid from Japanese bank accredited bank MUFG, and the project was in Chile. The UK board representative said that this is an innovative and high-risk project and also a good example that uses the right instruments of equity and finance to innovate and invest in risky investments. One project that was a little contentious for board members who blocked its approval initially on the first day was the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa project in Ghana by AFDB. The project was largely based on credit lines to local financial institutions, with the loans then to be provided to women's groups for investment in climate resilient agricultural practices. Many board members questioned the affordability of the loan. Stakeholder consultation was not elaborated in annexes, so it was unclear whether the loan was the most appropriate use of the GCF funding. The board worked with AFDB to revise the project, and assurances were given behind closed doors overnight. An additional grant element was later added and then rushed back through so the project could be approved. Many board members discussed the appropriateness of rushing such major changes through, and this questions whether any level of stakeholder consultation and consideration and thought can be put into a project that is revised at the board and rushed so quickly, when on average design of a project proposal takes around 8 months. The board also approved the accreditation application of 4 entities. 3 that were direct access were BNDES, based in Brazil, Ecobank Ghana Limited, the Ministry of Water and Environment of the Republic of Uganda, and the international entity was Enable, the Belgian Development Agency. Importantly, one of the most sticky issues, the procedures for decision-making in the absence of consensus, was approved at 3 a.m. On the 3rd day of the board meeting. Many concerns were shared regarding voting procedures, the appropriate representation from developed and developing country constituencies, and also a gender balance between board members, particularly if a small group needed to be formed to form this consensus. However, many board members said they wanted to push this forward in goodwill, and on the last day, as I mentioned, they did form a consensus on this consensus building issue. There were a number of items also presented to the board in regards to replenishment. Item 12A report from the replenishment process was presented. Board members mentioned that they needed to know better how much money will come in to the GCF during the replenishment in order to plan for the next 4 years. Perhaps it was suggested an additional board meeting after the replenishment process was necessary. The board adopted new standards for implementing anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism policy, and there's also an updated policy on prevention and protection from sexual exploitation, sexual abuse and sexual harassment. Unfortunately, the updated accreditation framework which was being proposed was pushed to the next board meeting. Among its proposed activities was a project-specific assessment approach, a PSSA, pilot framework, which would allow projects to be approved prior to accreditation of an accredited entity, which would check whether the entity applying for the project would be able to undertake the environmental, social safeguard and gender requirements of the board, of the GCF Secretariat. Alexandra Tracy, the active private sector observer, said that this would open up more opportunities for private entities to bring more projects to the board. Ian Adam from the private sector facility stated that the updated accreditation framework will give them a strategic direction to engage further with the private sector and would enable them to address more high-risk projects and utilise readiness funding to better integrate the role of the private sector within climate change. On the gender policy, Canada, USA and Sweden all stated that it must move forward, whilst Egypt and Canada had reported back on the gender working group that they developed to agree upon the text for the gender policy. Now, the next step is that there's more work for the Secretariat to work on to provide a cost-benefit analysis, which will explore the benefits of not having, of the GCF Secretariat, not having a fully extensive gender policy. Then this will be brought back to the board at B24. We also heard from the Independent Evaluation Unit's independent review of GCF performance. You see the link up there in the title. We heard from them that they had questions around, has the governing instrument of the GCF translated into the adequate structure for the fund to operationalise its mandate? Is the GCF able to channel and leverage significant investment flows? Is it capable to deliver and prioritise climate change needs in developing countries? And has the GCF business model been appropriate, and is it ready for the future? Some of the findings revealed that the GCF still has quite rigid policies, overlaps and unclear delegation, which is causing a large part of the delays in terms of project approval. Some of the actual value of the GCF's policies, the value for climate, are unclear, so they've asked to consider redefining those policies, and that the policies actually create big burdens on compliance for accredited entities, and there is a need to reduce this burden. There was also the mention of a differentiated model for different access modalities based on varying needs under the GCF. For example, reducing the policy burdens for direct access entities who have low-risk projects without a high level of finance requested from the GCF. The results weren't all negative. The results showed that the GCF has actually resulted in some good targeting of sectoral needs identified in countries' nationally determined contributions. They are doing well in terms of investments in energy and food, but not so well in the transport sector and ecosystems-based adaptation needs identified in nationally determined contributions. Twice the amount in US dollar nominal terms of investment is going into mitigation versus adaptation. However, the GCF is targeting needs quite well in regions with the largest variability in precipitation. The report also found that GCF is making very small contribution to country needs overall. Less than 1% of country needs on average are being met in terms of the targets in NDCs and other climate change plans. On the use of financial instruments by the fund's projects, it found that they are predominantly traditional, grant-based types of instrument. Only 35 projects out of the 111 approved have actually 2 or more types of financial instrument, and very few use a variety or innovate around this traditional approach. This represents a major opportunity. There's a need to come into the mitigation space to de-risk investments more. And there's also a possibility to innovate adaptation, especially the portfolio for multilateral investments. The structure of the Secretariat in that regards needs to become a life cycle and solutions-driven approach within the Secretariat with custodianship of GCF investments rather than one-off projects. The overall key findings and takeaways was that for paradigm shift, scale is important, co-finance ratio is low, but the impact can be actually achieved through more policy and policy sector results in the countries themselves, transformational change in sectors as well as behavioural change. There's a need to prioritise tools to bring in quality proposals, as currently there's long waiting times due to the low quality of proposals being turned out and submitted to the Secretariat. The findings encourage the need for a focused strategic plan within the GCF, which is currently under development alongside a theory of change. You can check the board documents on the website for more information on that. There is also the need for delegated authority to the Secretariat for procedures for the Secretariat to operate, and a need to deliver better to the needs of countries. In regards to that theory of change, the Secretariat is currently developing this theory of change to better explain the fund's vision for achieving a paradigm shift and how it can achieve key outcomes relating to its transformational programming, innovative and catalytic investments, and knowledge generation. This is intended to guide GCF activities and operations, as well as better facilitate better understanding among stakeholders of the GCF operating logic. It is anticipated that that theory of change will inform more detailed program and operational guidance, and it will be developed by the Secretariat later in 2019 with a focus on helping countries deliver transformational climate impact. The Secretariat also mentioned that they're looking at possible ways to syndicate with other funds such as the Global Environment Facility, the Climate Investment Fund and Adaptation Fund, and they discussed a possible meeting at COP25 of fund managers to see how to move from talks to action. The Secretariat will also present the GCF environmental and social safeguards for the board's consideration at its second meeting in 2021. The board deferred consideration of the evaluation policy of the GCF to its 24th meeting, and the ITAP stated that a lessons learned for accredited entities will be presented at the next board meeting, so keep an eye out for this. There will also be a review of the structure and operations of ITAP in 2020. Moving forward, some important dates: the Global Programming Conference, which is a move away from the regional programming conferences they used to have. Will be held with all accredited entities and NDAs in Songdo, 19th to the 23rd of August. Then the exciting Private Investment for Climate Conference, which ECO will also be attending alongside the Global Programming Conference, will be on 7th to the 9th of October. And of course, the next board meeting, B24, will be in Songdo from the 12th to the 14th of November. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to receiving your questions.